Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I have great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Pouw, who's our MTS speaker today. Wim got his PhD at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, where he's worked with many people we know, including Rolf Zwan, who was here giving an MTS talk not that long ago. And Wim worked on issues of embodied cognition in gesture and speech when he was in the Netherlands. And then he came to the University of Connecticut to do a postdoc at CESPA with Jay Dixon for a little while. And I've been following his work on motor synchrony in speech and hand gestures for a while now with great interest. And today he's going to tell us more about this work. Wim is a huge proponent of the open science framework and reproducibility in science. So he's he really puts his mouth where the money is, or the money where his mouth is, in terms of sharing all of his data. So we go to his website and actually see all the pre-registered reports in the open science framework that he stands for. So Wim's traveled very far to come and visit us all the way from the Netherlands. And when he returns to the Netherlands, he's going to start a new position at the University of Nijmegen, at the Donders Institute and the Max Planck. So we wish him very well on his new job that's about to start very soon. So please join me in giving a warm UC Merced welcome to Wim Pouw.
Yeah, thank you so much for hospitality today. It's already awesome. I'm very happy to stand in front of you and meet these people that I've been reading about so long now. Right? So thank you for that. Today I'll be talking about mainly 2 years of research about how gesture and speech couple, and or multimodal language production. So first, we know, as many people know painstakingly here that study the signal of speech, it is a multi-layered phenomenon operating on multiple timescales, one reaching into the other and connecting on these different levels. Yet we still enrich this signal, if you will, with some kind of visual or motor information. Specifically, you get a whole other system with its own interesting timescales that is not only put upon speech as to enrich it, but it's also coordinating at multiple timescales with speech. I'm going to just gesture so much that you're going to be sick of it, but I still want to show you some moving things of a moving picture of a gesture. So this is Angela Merkel.
Aber wir waren nicht darauf vorbereitet, dass einmal Druck auf unsere Außengrenzen entstehen könnte, zum Beispiel durch Luftbewegungen, und haben erst im Nachhinein Vorkehrungen treffen müssen, durch gemeinsame Grenzschutzpolizei und vieles andere mehr, um diese Freizügigkeit im Inneren abzusichern, und daran müssen wir weiter arbeiten.
Or diminished, stand up for it. You are the representatives of more than 500 million people. Be proud of it and stand up for it, and don't let those people.
Yeah, sorry. So it's not about the climax there, but so what I want you to notice first about the multi-scaliness of this gesturing skill that we have is that you see, for example, Angela Merkel is talking about borders or pressure on the borders, and she's using these kind of gesturing which somehow has a container or some kind of border to it, but at the same time her phrasal boundaries or her prosodic or quasi-rhythmic aspects in speech are oscillating with this kind of movement. So the one is imposed on the other. So there is no strict, and sometimes you will hear this in gesture research, but there is no strict, often there is no strict boundary between a gesture that depicts or a gesture that oscillates with quasi-rhythmic aspects of speech. Another thing is, for example, Camilla has done research on this, that you'll see that when the intensity of speech, the fluctuations that are faster, the gesture will also follow. You can decompose it, or you can reconstruct it as one system that oscillates together in intensity. So, for example, this, it's funny how I stopped it here. He's doing like this, but also speaking much more loudly, much more with prosodic contrast. But he's also literally beating this kind of prosody into his body, and that's what I'm going to talk about today as well. So, why multimodal? First, before I'm going to go to all this data, or a little bit of data that we generated, I first want to characterize my reading of the literature so far about why multimodal. So why do we have this coalition between systems which seem perfectly capable to operate independently, right? We can sign, for example, but we can also, some people also don't gesture, so it's not a necessary coupling, but somehow it might be productive. And we can address this question in the three types of how questions. So one, how does it originate in our species? So how did the gesturing, which is universal throughout all cultures that we know of, why did we recruit these gesturing movements? And how did it originate? We can ask, how is the skill or the gesture-speech coordination that you find in adult kind of skilled gesturing, how is it acquired throughout infancy? Or what kind of neural and non-neural background is necessary to couple gesture and speech? And cognitive or mechanistically, or however you will call it, but how is gesture-speech coordination, again, neurally situated, or how is it produced? What kind of cognitive abilities do you need to couple these two systems? So I'm just going to characterize this field quickly in my reading of this literature. And, what I feel is, for example, if you look at the phylogenetic origins of multimodal language, we have two kind of debates. One is that maybe gesturing or gesturing ability was actually preceding spoken language. The idea is that if you look at our closest living relatives, like the chimpanzee, some readings of the literature suggest that the vocal abilities are quite poor. So whilst they still have some rudimentary gesture system, for example, this in chimpanzees and bonobos can signal, for example, come closer. And they use this at a distance, so it's some kind of gesture, right? And also we know that in captivity, the chimpanzee, or like Coco, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's a signing gorilla. So even in captivity, there seems to be a proclivity to symbolic use of gesturing. So might it be true that maybe in our species gestures were first before we could even speak? Then you have those people that suggest, well, then you have to explain why speech emerged. Well, you have to, if you read the literature closely, it is true that, for example, chimpanzees have articulatory abilities like lip smacking that are much like the dynamics that are needed to control some kind of articulatory gesture, right? Or a gesture of the mouth in this case. So there is this debate, and there is much more to say about this, and it's always a little bit difficult with phylogenetic stories because it's always just so, right? But what I want to take, or what I want to highlight is, there is a shared assumption in this literature that the first gesture that was ever born was born out of referential necessity. It was something to depict. It was something to communicate something at a distance, or to stand in for things, absent state of affairs. So the assumption is that the idea is that there is somehow a social proclivities, or the social pressures drove our species to innovate referentially. And therefore use gestures or motor or hand movements in novel ways to refer to things in the environment. And I think it's difficult to start with reference if you want to have a bottom-up approach to something that emerged. That's one problem that I have. And I wonder if it's completely necessary. I think we have to explain reference, as I'm often referring, but 50% of my gestures are just doing this. So reference, I'm not sure if we should start there. So as Kendon, one of the proponents of gesture speech immersed in unison perspective, is still focusing on virtual worlds rather than present worlds, or the world as its best model, or whatever. So if we look at the cognitive origins, I do believe that I can use the cognitivist kind of idea that gesture and speech are decoupled as a strawman, but I think most gesture or psycholinguists are quite happy with the idea that these are entangled systems. So even at the conceptualization phase, when their movement is happening, already these two messages are being constructed or emerge out of systems that are already coupled. Even in the execution, if I perturb the system, then the other system will be affected. So they're constantly coupled. And this is a view that has been popularized by David McNeil, who suggests that gesture is part of a shared thought process with spoken language. Yet there are still some old adages or old ways of thinking inherited from cognitivist kind of thinking. So again, there are some people that are still cognitivist about this, so I'm not saying that they're not there anymore, I'm just saying that they're not in the majority anymore. So there's the idea that gesture are independent system. They are being recruited when the spoken system has problems, or the vocal system has problems, or the spoken language system has problems, for example, getting words, for example. Then I'll use gestures, but only as a system comes into place later on in this process. It's not that they're entangled. And something that comes out of a cognitivist way of thinking, you have two different systems that are different, yet they are seen coordinated. So how do we explain coordination? We need another kind of system, an interface that couples these two systems together. You need, for example, for this kind of coordination, you need a timing mechanism that is needed as the systems are initially coupled. So you need some kind of system that couples these two systems in unison, right? So, and this is something that I also find back sometimes in even entangled views. So some kind of other system that is checking the gesture trajectory with some kind of speech trajectory and couples them again because they were not coupled. The kind of McNeil theories, it's still a little bit descriptive. I think one of the most worked out proposals on how the entangled view might work is by Iverson and Thielen, very much dynamicists at Spirit, right? So they try to further work on a McNeilian view of a gesture and speech entangled, and they suggest, well, there is firstly a neural background at which gesture and speech coupling emerges from, specifically that hand-mouth linkages are existentially already there. In feeding, for example, I have to open my mouth and I have to move my hand. And these kind of existential or relations that are already given that we occupy a certain body, that will allow us to further develop it. And it's socialization processes that will allow these kind of skills to be repurposed for social communication, where it can, so it emerges out of already embodied relationships in that sense. Yet, still, there is a focus on the neural domain here, which I want to highlight because I want to contrast it a little bit. For example, they again talk about timing as well. So gesture and language timing may be the product of spreading levels of activation in brain areas, such that the portion of the region associated with speech production is activated. Activity spreads to the neighboring side associated with movement of the hand or arm. Patterns of co-activation may be influenced by common precise timing mechanisms in the latter parasylvian cortex, resulting in the production of gestures that are highly synchronous. So I really like their perspective because they are actually putting money where their mouth is in terms of getting some kind of entangled, more process, what would happen behind the scenes to account for coupling, this tight coupling. But still, I think maybe we can contrast a little bit with some new evidence that we're getting. So, just to have the field ready or just my reading again, the phylogenetic story is that everybody accepts that the primary or proper function in the Millikan kind of sense, function of gesture is referential. Gesture and speech are weakly coupled, or at least have already a proclivity of coupling and become neurally developed through developmental contingencies, for example, in the sensorial motor routines that we generally already operate with, for example, in hand, mouth, feeding. The cognitive thing is that often we still talk about timing or some kind of interface that must be present to couple these systems, as if they are actually still yet decoupled. Okay, so I want you to I remind myself that whatever we're coming up with, that it's really difficult to get a complete story, but at least you want to have some continuity with the kind of constructs that you're using. So if you're starting up with reference, you have to explain it on all these levels as well. And I wonder whether if there's really a homogeneous kind of answer to these three questions right now. And I hope at some point when I'm done with my work, in 50 years, we can have a more continuous story about how it emerged in our species, how it emerged in infancy, and how we can actually wield those powers like gesture, speech, coordination. First, maybe you shouldn't trust me on my work, right? So let me first say how they are entangled and what I think, why the evidence is so abundant that I think a majority of the people think that gesture and speech are tightly coupled. So there is research showing that, for example, if you have a finger tapping task where you have to say pa, pa, pa like this, At a certain amount I have to take a breath in, and my velocity or my amplitude of a movement will automatically adjust as I have to take in a breath. It happens quite unconsciously. So firstly it's coupled to the respiratory system. So they're coupled anyway, because they're reacting to a system that only the vocal system is really dependent on, right? There's also research on, for example, if I stress a word with a pitch accent, or acoustically this is, for example, with a higher fundamental frequency or a higher intensity, like pa, 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 pa. If I do this, then in the stressed syllable, my movement will also have a larger amplitude, even if I don't want to. If I do the reverse, for example, if I tap with a larger movement and then a smaller movement, automatically you will see that the mouth aperture will be larger. Again, all unconsciously, there is some kind of coordinative structure that's somehow coupled. Trevor and Peter show that you get this classic Kelso dynamic. So, for example, pa, 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 pa in phase, so saying pa and doing the beat at that moment, is much easier as a higher stability than doing pa, pa. I cannot even do it well because of my, because everybody's looking, but that's more difficult. So it's the same with this kind of dynamics, right? If you ramp up the speed, this will go in phase. This is a more stable coordinative structure than this one. We can go on and on. You get classic phase portrays that, for example, certain polyrhythms like 1 to 2, like 2 pas and one beat, is easier than more difficult 2 to 5, so 2 pas and 5, which is classic systems which you get in non-living systems as well, for example. Then finally, so this is all finger tapping. Another way this has been extended is, for example, if I have to name an object in the environment, for example, saying papa, so something is called papa and I have to point to it, the moment that I reach my maximum extension in a movement will align with the syllable that I'm stressing. So if I'm saying pa, pa, or pa, pa, then the maximum extension will tend to align with that stressed syllable. Even if people are not instructed to do this, somehow we are coupling these two kind of systems. And there's many more examples here. So you could wonder, what about fluid speech, right? This is all a little bit constrained tasks. There's this classic psycholinguistic research which already show that at least if you roughly look at when a gesture reaches some kind of salient moment in the stroke, without doing any motion tracking, you can already find that it often aligns. For example, in the middle somewhere is a peak in the fundamental frequency, or a pitch accent, more correctly, where something in your phrasing is stressed, some word or a syllable, and it often aligns with some moment where I'm actually giving some emphasis in my movement as well. And we did some recent motion tracking, you find the same. Specifically, you find that the peak velocity or a peak in deceleration often closely aligns with something that I'm stressing in speech. Like I'm giving an extra moment here, and I'm also stressed something in my speech just yet. So another thing that we published this year is about we can perturb the system as well, right? It's one thing to say that they're synchronous, and another thing is, do they find differences in sensoromotor solutions under perturbation? Does the system have some kind of dynamic stability? And one thing that we did is, it's actually a replication of a classic study by McNeil, who showed that if you have perturbed the linguistic system by a delayed auditory feedback with a 150 millisecond delay, so you hear yourself on 150 second delay, and it's quite creepy because you start to slur your speech because you're hearing yourself and you're trying to catch up, but you never will. So this is from a pilot data. I'll show you what the kind of effect is happening when somebody is doing this.
Lifting things and being on cue and whatnot, and the grandma quickly realizes, or always realized, it was the cat, and
Microphone.
Hits it on the head, and the cat is kicked out of the apartment again. So the next scheme is that the grandma's checking out of the hotel or the apartment or whatever the building is, and the cat overhears this conversation, and
yeah, so you get slur, right? And we could wonder, so if I go back again, we could wonder what happens to these normal distributions if you're perturbing the system. Is it the case that they become less asynchronous because one system is actually slowed down and the other moves just about, right? From a cognitivist perspective, we would think, well, these systems are not coupled, so they should just do their thing anyway. Again, we have people so we have a no delayed auditory feedback and then a delayed auditory feedback, and we just looked at the timing. We did a bunch of other stuff, but I'm just going to move quickly over this. But what we found is actually, what we find in these normal distributions where you have the nearest peak in the fundamental frequency of the acoustics, right, which says something about the stress in speech, and the peak velocity of a gesture, they are more peaked distribution for the delayed auditory feedback. So here you see the delayed auditory feedback just indicated by 150 millisecond delay, right? And you see these two distributions. One are the gestures and speech produced under the no delayed auditory feedback, and the delayed auditory feedback, the green one, produced when there was a feedback loop, right? And what we see is actually gesture and speech seem to be more coupled. You can see this by the peakiness of the distribution. We find consistently, and we replicated ourselves in this experiment as well with some other data as well, where we find that it seems that these two systems are coupling more strongly on the delayed auditory feedback. And we reasoned that, well, maybe it's because these two systems are more stable in their performance together if they're oscillating together. If you have a second interfering oscillator that is moving in or is interfering out of phase with two systems, if they're coupled together, they're stronger. So our idea was that, or we think that these two systems, for example, if you're at a bar and the music is really loud, maybe you will gesture more, you will speak louder, but you will also be more synchronous, only because there is perturbing effects all the time. But this way you can stabilize the system. You can make use of two systems that one is simply more stable together, right? What we also found is that gesture is not unaffected. It is slowing down. Maybe you saw it in the video as well. Some gestures were really slowed down, and they were slowing down at actually a too fast a pace, as if almost synchronizing with the delayed auditory feedback. It seems that this gesture system is not informationally encapsulated. It's also affected by this delay, as if synchronizing with the delayed auditory feedback. And given so the idea is that it's a fully open system that is being attracted by this interfering signal for the gesture system. It's interfering with the speech signal. And because the gesture system is not so much interfered by it, but is attracted to it, these two systems can co-opt each other's intrinsic dynamics to create a more stable system. So finally, the final study that I want to talk about is, so we know that speech and gesture couple well, right? So is it also the case that can we detect, based on what kind of language that you're speaking, that we know that have different kind of stress patterns overall, can we also just look at a basic way of moving about, and whether that depends on, for example, when I'm speaking Spanish or English, I cannot speak Spanish, but when I'm speaking Spanish or English, can we detect on some basic level something that reflects that language? And I'm not going to show that, but I'm going to show you that something that looks like it. So we have 15 bilingual speakers that are speaking Spanish and English by retelling several cartoon scenes. And they're just also gesturing naturally. We don't ask them to gesture, but they do. They of course they have a motion tracker in there, so they might know that something's up. What we did is we have produced with this data set 469 English gestures, 863 Spanish gestures, and we asked the question: is it the case that these two systems are somehow related in their structure, or can we somehow differentiate between this? So one way of doing this is the whole method that we apply, but we can do some kind of wavelet analysis where we can say, well, we have this gesture one, so this is a person that did a first gesture and then did a second gesture and gestured a bunch, right? We can, for every gesture that occurred, we can compare those gestures to each other. So we can ask, is a Spanish gesture similar to an English gesture? And what we did is we defined it on the frequency domain. So we asked, how fast is this velocity profile of this gesture? How fast are these oscillations? So this one is more on the 3 Hertz range, this oscillation, primarily, and it shifts a little bit as it goes on. And this gesture has a velocity profile that is operating on a slightly slower time scale. So you have a higher, around the almost 1 Hertz range, or 2 Hertz range kind of time scale that is dominant. And what we can do is, we can just ask the question, so how much of this red area is actually defining the signal instead of the blue area? And we can ask, well, some gestures are more faster scale, they are moving faster, and some are moving less fast. And if you compare them, you can draw, for example, this difference curve in the distribution of those periodicities, and take the integral, and then say, well, either they have a score of 0, which means that they're perfectly operating at the same time scale, or they're really different. So some are fast-moving gestures, and some are really slow-moving gestures, and then you get a high area under the curve, and then you say, well, these gestures are not alike in their oscillatory properties. So what we did is you can make a matrix out of that by comparing every gesture that I, for example, am making. I compare every gesture that you make, and you can actually make networks out of that. So you can actually see if this, in an ideal world, you get subpopulation. So some gestures might oscillate at 3 Hertz perfectly, and some gestures might oscillate at 4 Hertz perfectly. Then you would get subgroups in this network. What you rather find is a more continuous way. But what we can ask is it the case that gestures that we're comparing that are between languages, so Spanish versus English, do they have a closer distance together as compared to gestures that are producing the same language? So Spanish and Spanish gestures might operate on similar time scales as opposed to Spanish and English. And that's something we find preliminary evidence for. So if you look at the within language distances, they are smaller, and if you look at the between language distances, they are higher. You can also just forget about the network approach and look at the density distributions of the periodicities, and we also find a similar effect that at some frequencies, gestures that are produced under Spanish seems to differ from gestures that are produced under English. So the main point is that some people that have popularized this view here very well, right? So we cannot make a difference between gestures are not non-linguistic. They are already in their very basic way of motor control already oscillating at some property of speech. The problem is though, we haven't correlated with some aspect of speech. So that's something we need to do. It's just now saying that there is some difference depending on language, and this is actually very exploratory work. But I still want to popularize the idea that that gestures are not non-lingual or not linguistic. They're already constrained by language and a very basic way of moving about. Okay, so I hope I have made a convincing case that the cognitivist view is no longer really tenable, right? Or at least you need to account for a whole lot. Yeah. So again, this is the more ambitious project maybe is to get a more continuous account of the findings that we've talked about right now and how to couple that with phylogeny and ontogeny. This is the second part of the talk about that. Okay, so like I told, there's these well-known phenomenon that gesture and speech, and even in spontaneous kind of gesture and speech, you have this coupling where you see a tight synchrony between some kind of acoustic peak and some kind of peak in the kinematics of gesture, right? So what I said about the pointing movement, for example, so the maximum or the peak in deceleration aligns with the stressed syllable. And this generally has been explained by some kind of interface that times these systems in unison, right? And you need some kind of neural interface. And we, in this study, we approach it a little bit differently. So we know from basic human movement research, whatever you're doing, even if you're moving like this will have effects on the muscle here. It will pull immediately to keep you upright. You will fall over. And some people who don't have this ability of proprioception will fall over even doing this. So first thing we should know is that a gesture is not simply a movement it's not contained locally, it reverberates globally. And more specifically, so you have these anticipatory postural adjustments, so it will affect some muscles here as well, but also the kind of forces that I'm producing with the physical impetus that I'm producing, like beating this into my body. We know that this system that we have is comprised of tensile elements, so the muscles and the fascia system, and compressive elements like the bones, and they make sure that this system has an active equilibrium. We are always pre-stressed. Even if I'm standing, I'm pre-stressed. Things are exerting force so as to keep me upright. And what you have when you have a tension element, if I pull here, it will have effects here. And that's something we're doing here right now as well. If I'm gesturing, these effects are not locally contained. They reverberate to a pre-stressed system. So we could just ask the question, right? If somebody is vocalizing and you're moving about, will it have effect on acoustics via the respiratory system? So will it have effect because my lung pressures change as a function of the muscles that are recruited for my gesture coordinative structure? Will it affect acoustics? So what we have people do is, we have people sitting and standing, because we know if people are standing, your postural integrity is lower, so you'll have more forceful muscle contractions to keep yourself upright. And we have different kind of forceful movement. So we have a wrist motion like this, with a faster kind of beat at the downward phase. We have a movement like this, so with the whole arm, so it has it's generating more forces, right? And we have two hands like this. And people are moving at a particular frequency that we like. So we set them at 1.3 hertz, and it's connected to the motion tracker, so they see if they're going too fast, and they can adjust the bar a little bit and go a little bit slower. So that's basically the very simple task. And people are taking one breath and doing this, like this. And we're asking participants to keep as stable as possible acoustic output. And if they feel that their breath is not sufficient anymore to keep that stable output, they have to stop. That's one trial. What we find is, if we look at the fundamental frequency in red here, and the amplitude envelope, or a smoothed amplitude envelope, so roughly the intensity of the waveform, what we see is for the passive, people are okay, and you still see some random jitter. For the wrist, it's already a little bit more perturbed. For the one-arm beat, you see these peaks at moments where maximum extension is reached, a moment where the physical impetus is highest. It's not here, but it is here that your body needs to react to keep postural integrity. And it is here where forces are reverberating to a preset system. If you do a two-arm beat, you also see it. So here you see in black the movement, so it's a vertical positional data. And whenever you get at a downward phase at the stop, you get these peaks in the acoustics. And this is just a moving target, so it's moving over the time series, as it were. You see these larger oscillations, which is actually the hand movement. So there's information about movement in these acoustics. So if you look at the peak and deceleration, you see a peak in the acoustics. Right, so this is a different representation of the data, but it's the same story. So when we do the analysis, we look at the periodicities in movement. So for example, we have people move at 1.3 hertz, right? And you see in a frequency spectrum kind of analysis, you will find these peaks at these frequencies, but you also find them in the acoustics. So the kind of movement information pops up in the acoustics. So the main points for now, there are some more points to this, but gestures may couple with acoustics through biomechanics. And what is most important is that we find these positive peaks in the fundamental frequency and positive peaks in the amplitude envelope, which is non-coincidental, because the pitch accent, at least in non-pragmatically, non-ambiguous situations, and what I mean by this is that sometimes acoustics is not defining all the things that we hear in, for example, speech acoustics, but it is no coincidence that we find peaks in the fundamental frequency and peaks in the intensity at moments of peak and deceleration of the movement, because these are markers of stressed speech. And that's why the literature, it's not that we found negative peaks or anything. We found something that is very important for our prosodic aspects of speech. Again, this is not speech, right? So this is just a steady state vocal output. So how about more realistic speech? So in the follow-up study, we're still not there for the realistic speech, but we did a follow-up study that we're about to submit, and we had people do a monosyllable vocalization. So not one steady state vocal output, but people had to do, say, pa, pa at 1 second intervals. You see a visual metronome and just have to say pa, 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 like that. We had people sitting, and they were either doing nothing, so they're not doing any movement. They're doing a wrist movement with their dominant hand, like this, similar as the other experiment, and we have just an arm movement like this. So we do not reach the physical impetus that we reach in the other experiment. So, but we want to have a direct. So our hypothesis was that there is the connecting system is the lower vocal tract. So lung pressures are being affected by muscles that are part of the coordinative structure of movements. But you do have to show it directly, right? It can still be a brain coupling that the other experiment could still be some kind of brain coupling that can explain those kind of findings. You need something more. So we have a respiration valve that measures the chest activity or the circumference of the trunk, where you have, if you take a deep breath, you will have higher readings, but also if I have some muscle constrictions, you also get peaks in these readings because your circumference will be larger because the muscles pull in, right? So again, what is interesting about the Pouw is that it's a plosive. The plosive is not, there is no focalization at the there is only a buildup of force. So you could wonder, if we already changed the scenario, do we still find the same effects? And another thing we should wonder, because it's not steady state focalization, the timing of this peak deceleration also needs to be quite well timed with the moment of that focalization, right? So there's there is a sensitive role of timing here. So one of the other kind of manipulations that we had, so for example for the arm in phase, you see the time series of the vertical displacement of the arm movement. And here you see the moment that they're focalizing is the moment where they reach this peak in deceleration. They're trying to time pa at the in phase beat, like this, pa, 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 like that. And again, we're measuring the fundamental frequency, the amplitude envelope, so roughly tracing out the waveform, right? And we have this respiration time series. And then we have another condition where people are moving out of phase. So people are doing this. So after this peak in deceleration, where you're bracing, and then in the upward phase, you see that's in a red stroke, you'll see that in the upward phase, a Pouw is produced. Now, you can maybe predict that we are not predicting that the effects will show up here, right? Because if I'm not focalizing and I'm already absorbing that kind of energy when I'm not focalizing, it doesn't need to be dissipated by this system. So we're expecting that we only find this effect in the arm in phase, right? So this is actually all the information that you need. So this is the average trajectory of the amplitude envelope. Let's look at this one first. And we see that for the wrist in phase and the arm in phase, you get these higher trajectories of the focalization. So this is all, these are all Pouws, and then you take the amplitude envelope and you actually take the mean of all these different trajectories, and then you will see that the purple and the green one, the wrist in phase and the arm in phase, have higher peaks at those moments. So they reach higher energetic outputs, and for the respiration here, you see the same. So you see that the purple one is starting with a higher respiratory or chest kinematic output, and then the wrist one, and then the other conditions, right? For the F0, we didn't find anything. And this is something like a common thread to all these findings. The fundamental frequency is not affected anymore by our findings, or by our manipulations. It's gone. So again, if we can also look at the in-phase condition and see the more closely look at the timing, where there's a peak of deceleration in the movement, and we can ask how far is it away from the focalization. How further you are away from the focalization, the lower your acoustic peak will be. So we find a relation that even at a micro scale, at like 0 to like half a second, if you go closer to the peak of deceleration, those peaks in the amplitude envelope go up. We find the same relations for the wrist and the arm motion for the max respiration. Also, just to remind yourself, these wrist motions are quite subtle, but they have effects on acoustics in amplitude envelope and respiration, but less so, right? And we have we find no relations with the fundamental frequency. Again, we can ask, well, maybe respiration and acoustics are not necessarily coupled. From the literature in phonetics, we know that we sometimes, if we put a stress on some kind of syllable, we get these chest pulses. Not everybody uses them, so it's also a little bit person-specific. But what we find indeed for the passive condition, if you look at the peak of the output during a focalization of the respiration system, if it's higher, you also find a higher acoustic output. So they're also related when there's no movement. And this is again the peak amplitude, right? It's an amplitude envelope. But for the wrist or the arm motion, if you're moving in phase or out phase, it doesn't really matter. These systems become more coupled, or at least the relation between some kind of chest wall kinematic output is more closely related to the acoustic output. So if you have a higher chest wall activity, you also have a higher acoustic output. So these systems are coupled. They're more coupled when there is movement, but they're still coupled where there is no movement. So it seems that there is some kind of synergy between these systems, especially when you're moving. And again, this is for the left one is all amplitude envelope, and then here we have the F0, and there is no effects there. So to conclude on this, I think this research at least provides a first beginning that the respiratory chest wall kinematics are implicated in these kind of gesturing effects. They are having an effect on respiration. Respiration is correlated with acoustic output. We also find, so gesture, the idea is gesture affects the lung pressures, and they are dissipated as energetic output in the vocal system. Yet it doesn't mean, so we don't find a fundamental frequency, right? We don't find effects there. And this is precisely because this energy bump in the lung pressure that is being affected by this gesturing doesn't need to be dissipated as changes in F0, because the vocal cords can adjust. There are sensorial solutions that are being solved by the fundamental frequency, in the sense that you can adjust your vocal cord, or the stiffness might change as a function of what you are saying. For example, we know that if you're doing a plosive, the vocal cords will stiffen, and this increased stiffness might actually counteract the effects that we've been describing in terms of energy bumps that are being dissipated. So we know that the plosive can change the whole situation already. It says something about the complexity of the system, that it doesn't always need to be the case. But I guess the constraints are there. The behavioral kind of effect may not always be present in the fundamental frequency. Although in the amplitude it must be there. Again, this is still not fluid speech, right? So I'm still have to do a lot there. So, okay, so now I'm going to extend this paradigm a little more, because I've been a little bit too individualistic, right? So gesture, its main field of operation is the social environment, right? Where is the social environment in this? So gesture is a social tool of kinds, and we haven't really gone into that yet. So one thing we could ask is, okay, so there is structure there is information about movement in the acoustics. Can somebody attune to that information? So I'm going to let you listen one trial of somebody moving her wrist. I think it was her. Moving her wrist like this. And see if you can find a pattern, and imagine if you could synchronize with her movement. So maybe at the end you hear a little bit of oscillation, but it's still quite subtle. So we can ask, are people sensitive to the information of movement, and can they synchronize their own movement with that of the vocalizer? So we have vocalizers and listeners, and we're asking, can they attune to this kind of information and couple to it? And so we have 6 different vocalizers. We want to have a little bit of diversity between people that are vocalizing, because we know, for example, that males have a lower fundamental frequency, so females generally have a higher fundamental frequency. So we want to have some diversity there. So we created some stimuli with people doing the same movement. So they're doing this movement or they're doing this movement, all within subjects, right? So we're creating some data. And they're creating this data where there's, at moments we replicate it again, that you have at the peak deceleration you get these peaks. We want to have different tempos that people are moving at, otherwise we might have chance synchronization. So we have people moving at 1.6 hertz, 1.33 hertz and 1.6 hertz. So a slower and a medium and a fast movement. And they're doing that again via this bar that directs their movement depending on what the motion tracker is detecting, right? What the movement frequency is. So we record their movements and we record their sound. Yeah.
I was just wondering why it's 1.06 hertz. Is that just to keep it?
It's if you convert it to BPM, you get I don't know, 80, 90 or something like that. Then you get just normal integers. But so this is all the information that we have, right? There are 6 vocalizers. They're moving at fast, wrist or arm, and at medium and slow speed. So this is all the information of all the participants, and they all have this structure where you find a little bit larger, faster kind of signal, where you have a large amplitude oscillation, and here you have a little bit slower. And this is actually all the information that we ask people to attune to. So again, how can people synchronize? There can be different ways. They can synchronize with the beat, as it were. They can synchronize their tempo, even though they know nothing about where the movement is in terms of the phasing. So we can have, for example, a full asynchrony, a tempo synchrony, where you have that they're moving at the same tempo. You could also have that they sometimes hear a specific beat, and you can synchronize their phasing, although their frequency is different, right? So then you have tempo asynchrony. But you also have full asynchrony, where you have tempo matching, but also when the, when the listener has his or her hand here, if the vocalizer has his or her hand here, then the listener should detect that, and it has also the movement here. So they're moving perfectly in synchrony, right? And we're measuring that with a relative phase. We can ask how many degrees do you have a deviance on the circular scale. So if you have 180 degrees, then you have out phase, and if you have 0 degrees, then you have perfect in phase, right? And you can just check from the frequency distributions of the tempo, do they overlap? And I'm going to show you the results here. So we find actually both for the wrist, and this is more subtle sound, and in the arm it's a little bit more pronounced. We find first tempo synchronization. So no matter if you look at the slow, medium, or fast tempo, the vocalizer's maximum or the dominant periodicities are indeed faster for the faster tempo, because we asked them to move faster, right? But listeners also move faster or slower depending on the condition. And you find it for the arm movement and for the wrist movement. The wrist movement is a little bit more subtle, so you'll find that they're a little bit, it's more difficult. So then we can ask, are they actually fully synchronizing? So the phase synchronization, we see here, all the normal distributions are nicely, except for maybe the faster movement. We see a nice normal distribution around the 0 degree relative phase, which means perfect coupling with a certain error threshold. But this is how you want to see synchronization, I guess. What we think we show here is that it's not only the gesture and print acoustics, people are keenly sensitive to it. We weren't actually not expecting that the wrist movement, which is very subtle, that people were able to do that, because we already had difficulties. Well, maybe that's my poor analysis on my side, but it was difficult for me to get actually the wrist kind of acoustic signal out of it. And it's actually more, it's intensity, but it's also form and structure that is affected by, for example, these movements, what we found in earlier work as well. So it's changing a lot of things, but it's sometimes difficult to only look at the fundamental frequency and get this movement out. But people are really keen, they can do it very well. So what I'm trying to put forward is, also by this extra extensioning and social interaction kind of paradigm, is that gesture is just another embodied constraint on the vocal system. We know, for example, or there is research suggesting that, for example, the way that we started eating at some point in our recent past, that we started to eat more easily digestible food, that our palate also changed, and maybe it also affected the kind of development of the, for example, this kind of sound, because the palate is moving forward. We know that in the wild, that in our closest relatives, for example, in orangutans or marmosets, is that these animals are already detecting whether, from the acoustics alone, when somebody is stronger or taller, for example, than other conspecifics, just by listening to the acoustics. So they call this indexical cues. Even in humans, and they only find this for males somehow, but if I'm roaring, for making a roaring sound, you can estimate my chest circumference, which is not very much. But if you have somebody who's really back and really strong, you can hear that in the acoustics. It's not perfect, and it works only for males, and it works only for roaring, not for screaming. So if I would scream, it wouldn't work. But again, it's already there. There's already information about embodied states in acoustics. So embodied information at a distance just by listening to the acoustic, and it's also something that is already being exploited. For example, orangutans cock their hands before their mouths to lower the fundamental frequency. Now I'm actually lowering my fundamental frequency, but you can do it like this, and then they sound more threatening or more more threatening in size, even though their conspecifics cannot see them, or enemy or predators cannot see them. So it's already something that is being used, as it were. And I'm just saying this gesturing, fundamentally, the first gesture might not have been born referentially. It's just one referential system affecting our focal system in this way. So, well, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as well. But again, so we can ask, well, this is not spontaneous coupling, right? I did not ask participants what body part is somebody moving at, and the people cannot do that from acoustics, I'm sure. I'm also thinking that we could wonder whether there is spontaneous coupling if people are just moving, just like metronomes. Is there spontaneous coupling, right? There are much more things to do. You could also wonder, and this is another important point that I want to make, hand gestures have been classically associated with, for example, emotional states. So if I'm being anxious or happy, I'll gesture more. Prosody, so quasi-rhythmic aspects or salient aspects in speech has also classically been related to emotional states. So my vocal cords will tension more if I'm more anxious. But also the kind of range that occurs in prosody will also change as a function of my anxiousness or my happiness, right? And if it's really monotone, then there are not a lot of fluctuations in, for example, the fundamental frequency. I'm saying, well, it's not that weird that prosody and gesture is coupled as well, because we might literally hear somebody on the phone tensioning his or her body. It's perceiving something directly about somebody's embodied states, as it were. You can wonder how direct it is, or maybe indirect, or at least the acoustics is not only acoustics. It's something that is maybe more primordial to acoustics, which is also bodily tensioning, which is affecting the lower vocal tract. Again, where is fluid speech, right? This is again a vocalization. And the only thing that I can say to that right now is that there's recent research from people from MIT that trained a deep learning neural network on speech, acoustic data, and the kinematics of gesturing of this person. So you feed this neural network and you train that network on the kind of correlations that are there between kinematics and movement. And it's fluid speech. And then these people synthesize gesture. So based on, they fed this neural network some new novel speech, and they can create gestures that are, to me, and I've been looking at a lot of gestures, are to me indistinguishable from any kind of, or they don't look artificial to me. So I'll show you first. So.
So, try and separate the two. Now the good news is, these days, very few people will say they are completely anti-vaccine. Instead, like the president. So
these gestures are fake. They are only born through previous learned associations between the acoustic signal and the gesturing. Which means, or these kind of deep learning models, although we don't know what they're actually detecting in the acoustics, we at least know that there is information so specific in the acoustics alone that specifies this movement trajectory of a gesture. And as you'll see, these gestures are not depicting an apple or whatever is being said in speech. These are the oscillatory kind of gestures that I am very fond of, and that I maybe also overemphasizing, So, but I think we should start here with these kind of oscillatory gestures, and indeed there's information in acoustics, even in very fluid speech. And my project has been focusing more on what kind of information is there. And this project just starts at the other end, just proving, as it were, if there is relevant information. One really cool result from this study is that if they, for example, feed this neural network that was trained on this person, with my acoustics, for example, the model breaks down. So there is some kind of overfitting in the sense that this model, you cannot train a general model. So it may be that the kind of body that I have are specific to the kind of acoustic effects that these have on my body, and these are personally invariant. But you cannot generalize it to another person. Yeah.
So keeping it within the same person, do you expect that you would see the same kind of breakdown if they spoke English and not Spanish?
Well, I don't know too much about how sensitive deep learning models are with regards to what they are trained on, right? I would, but if I have to, it's more fun if I produce an answer. I think yes. Wait, I predict no. You know why? Because it's not about the content so much. It's about prosodic differences. These prosodic differences, will be different gestures because the prosody is different. But I guess all the information was there already in the English acoustics. Although when I'm saying this, I already think, well, there are maybe some correlations that you cannot learn from English and gesture alone. But it's a really good question.
So quickly,
Yeah.
in the earlier, when you showed that there was almost like twice as many Spanish gestures that were there.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
Natural learning how many gestures there are in that language.
Well, no, yeah, there are general differences in how much we gesture in a language. It's also, for example, even if I would be bilingual in Turkish, for example, and I would speak Dutch, I will gesture less, even if Dutch was my first language or my second language. So it seems that we attune to the kind of genre that we're talking in as well. So yes, that's really that's well spotted, because I think a lot of those findings that we find could be correlated with that as well. Okay, but just to wrap up, I want to say there is information in acoustics about body movements. And what this means, I think, that phylogenetically, I'm not saying that the primary function of gesture might be some kind of coordinative structure of the vocal system. I'm just saying that you need to account for that in your phylogenetic story. And I think maybe the first gesture was not born out of a referential need. It was born out of screaming from the top of your lungs and tension in your body, instead of some beautiful gesture that emerged out of a reaching action. I rather think that maybe if we start with acoustics and we know that gesture-speech coordination is so tight, maybe we can we can get at a new story. It's still a story, maybe, but I think it's more basic and it allows you to move more fluidly. You could still ask, well, what about reference, right? But still, I think if you're thinking about reference, often the reason why gesture first account is so popular is because it has a more primordial reference, in the sense that, for example, I can draw something out. It's an iconic reference instead of doing something arbitrary, right? But I think before iconic representation, there are biomechanical invariants that are even more primordial than iconic representations. First we do this, and at some point we don't vocalize and we do this. And that comes straight out of biomechanical invariance. So if you want to go primordial, go with this, I think. So, ontogeny, we know that, for example, Ejiri et al. Showed that, for example, the kind of spontaneous motor babbling and vocal babbling that children do, if it's more synchronized, the vocal quality is more speech-like or more adult-like. So it seems, I think, that ontogenetically we experience these kind of biomechanical invariants as a child as well. We move our hands, and at some moments they are just by matter of chance synchronizing their movement, and you get a different acoustic output. These things get socialized, and now I'm going really fast, I don't know how it happens, but I'm just saying that these things are just there from the get-go. They are straightforwardly emerging from the biomechanics of your body, and children are constantly exploring these kind of invariants anyway, so this can also have a story on an ontogenetic level. Again, so gesture-speech coupling, I still was talking about timing, right? I still may want to have an account that you need to time your pa with the moment that you're having this peaking velocity. Whatever you come up with in a cognitive story, we need a cognitive story, but a cognitive story will use the resources of the system that are already there. So even if this doesn't have enough effects on my acoustics, I can modulate by just sensing the kind of micro effects it will have on my lower vocal tract. These are something that a cognitive system will use because it's computationally less costly instead of simulating the trajectory. I just have to sense it, right? Yeah. Just to wrap up then. I think cognitively, all cognitive views were not tenable anymore, right? I think there's so much evidence there. And maybe, Camilla, I'm not sure whether you agree or not, but I think it's a little bit of a strong, if we still use that, but it's more, but still we need a better story of the entanglement view, and that's really not there, I think, yet. Then I think that if we tie this into the larger literature and radical embodied cognitive science, is that if gesture and speech acoustic are coupled biomechanically, we can see that some kind of morphological computation. Again, it emerges straightforwardly out of this system. And for example, we can call this a morphological computation, if you will. So popularized by Randall Beer and Rodney Brooks, but also, for example, shown by Gasamvar. They show, for example, in marmosets that suddenly change as they grow older, suddenly change their vocalizations from a really low, high pitch to a really lower pitch kind of vocalization. And what they showed is actually when the pharynx is growing, as they grow bigger, you get a nonlinear dynamic phase change, where they suddenly change as a function of something that changes continuously. And they also found if you, for example, make the air lighter through injecting helium, you can collapse that phase change back. I think the same thing is that gestures were some kind of driver for a phase change that was not right there or possible of the system in and of itself. It needed this coalition of biomechanical couplings to produce that kind of effect. Let's ditch the non-referential, or let's ditch the referential first account. I think we should first do biomechanic invariance. Again, this is the final thing. It's not coincidental that gesture, emotion, and prosody are connected together. They're connected there because the bodily tensioning is some kind of aspect of our lived experience. And gestures are part of our lived experience through that kind of embodiment. So, to wrap up, gestures are not only seen, they're not visual information, they can be heard too. And maybe we can even hear them on the phone. Yeah, that's it. I want to thank James Dixon, Stephen Harrison, and Alex Paxton. Some of you know them very well. They've been crucial in this research. Yeah, thanks.
We have plenty of time for questions, and as is tradition, we'll begin with students first.
I was wondering about the role of cognitive control in coupling these, because in some of the studies that you mentioned, delayed auditory feedback, you've made the task that the participants are doing more difficult. So I'm wondering, what's the role of sort of consciously controlling the coupling between your speech act and your gesture act in your theorization about the multimodal coupling of speech and gesture?
Yeah, I think it's something we can modulate. It's something we can pay attention to, and I suspect that even that if you're paying more attention to it, that you get some kind of stability on some kind of output that you're trying to maintain, right? So trying to keep a steady, fluid speech, it might help to intentionally couple like that. It's just difficult. I don't know how much intentionality is involved there. First, because I don't know how to make any judgments about that, because I certainly don't have a phenomenology where I'm not using my gestures as I'm setting I don't know, like in a real well-controlled pitch talk, for example. Some people are practicing their gestures, right? I don't know how to do that. I can only go back to my own phenomenology. But yes, I do think it is possible, and you can exploit it, and yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I also think with regards to the delayed auditory feedback, that was my story, and I still think it's a little bit story-like. There can be many explanations why you see more peak distributions, I guess. Yeah.
I'm just curious, so this is just a pure curiosity question. It's a really interesting talk. And so it seems like the prosody gestures, or the gestures that go with prosody, they kind of constrain the space for what the sound signal could be, right, to some extent.
Yeah.
Among other things, something they can do. And I'm wondering with the sort of the semantic gestures, like the shaking of the container, stuff like that, if there's any competition between the two when you're using them.
Yeah.
Like, does needing more semantic constraint to make the message more clear, does that interfere with the prosody gestures, or do they just go together seamlessly? Or?
Yeah. So there is first they are constrained. In even an iconic gesture, you'll see that the peak velocity, often if I'm saying the next one, even in this movement, during the next one, I will have a higher velocity, for example. So these things are intertwined, but I'm sure that if you, with the right experiment, you can get a need for drawing something out that cannot be accommodate the prosody as such. So you get competition, and I think the next step is somehow getting more into the semantic kind of coupling. Is it part of this kind of coupling system, or is it super? I don't know. I think the problem with this research, now you have maybe a phylogenetic story, but how to couple with the semantics, right? Because some gestures are just doing this, for example, and they're not oscillating at all, and there are many gestures that are just depicting something. Yeah, so I think there could be ways where you get these kind of, where you want to do one thing, but the other thing is actually the most important, or something like that. Yeah, I'm going to wonder about experiments you could do to do that.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Have people looked at, and this may not be entirely relevant to this, but have people looked at data where someone who's signing is also basically saying the same thing when they're signing? Like, I know that's not really gesture, but like there may be parts of that, so the gestures or the movements that they're doing that are relevant.
Yeah, so one thing is that even for signers, it's still multimodal. There's a lot of facial expressions, also articulatory movements, but also sometimes sounds that co-occur with these kind of movements. I'm not a sign expert, but I still want to broaden it a little bit out of whether these kind of physical impetus also first gives some kind of prosodic marking in sign, but also whether this kind of affects other coalitions of multimodality that are so much there. If you look at a signer, the face is always moving, and sometimes also making sounds, vocalizations. Yeah, that's a good one.
You were suggesting that the entrainment of gesture and speech might emerge through some developmental constraints. That was the term you used. I was wondering if you've thought about what those constraints would be.
Well, in my story, that would be that a child will be motor babbling, just randomly motor babbling and vocalizing. And at some points, they'll detect some kind of invariant, or they detect that the kind of outputs they can produce in their vocal system might be enlarged, for example, when moving at the same time. So it allows them to explore the state space, as it were, of the vocal system, and can reach more boundaries, or it can reach more boundaries areas by using a multimodal coalition, just by gesturing, right? And I think that is something that the child becomes keenly aware of, and also that's something that will be promoted during interaction. So, but it's a just so story. So, but we know from the literature that children are always moving about as if randomly, and they're also vocalizing as if randomly, and these things. There's actually a lot of research still to do there, and I know some recent research was not published yet, but for example, that you see that the peaks in velocity are very correlated with the kind of vocalization that you get with these children or infants.
So one suggestion, depending on how your Spanish-English data come out with adult, is what I was noticing is it might be timed, so Spanish is very syllable timed language, and English is a little bit slower. And so if your gestures with adults come out like that, with the same adult mapping to different languages, you can imagine, it'd be interesting if the language is driving that constraint.
And if you would already find that kind of structure in infants that are just learning the language, for example. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. But it's still difficult. I was talking to Chris about this, so I need to correlate it with something in structuring speech, but it's quite hard, even because the stress time and syllable time, that's really controversial as well. Nobody has really nailed that acoustically, I guess. But I wonder, but I need to find it, and maybe a good way is to start with that, with what you were suggesting. Yeah.
These are really impressive results. And I have a question about the Pouw study. You didn't get results with F0 synchronizing, and you suggested that might be due to the fact that Pouw is an unvoiced plosive. And
and the vocalization afterwards is always different as a function of that kind of plosive.
Because you've stiffened up the...
Yeah, so that's what,
Have you considered trying it with a voiced plosive like ba, or maybe a voiced fricative like va?
Yeah, so I think that's the next thing to do. Because you could also say, well, your effects are already crumbling on this simple contextual effect, right? So yeah, that's something on the agenda.
And you would predict that the F0 effects might show up with something like that.
Yeah, that's a definite prediction. Yeah, and we know there's solid research that if you have a P before a vowel, that vowel F0 acoustics will change with a high fundamental frequency and then with steep off. Unintentionally, it has, and it's about the pressures that are being built up and the stiffening as a reaction to that of the vocal cords. That's the idea right now. But yeah, we should, if it's a ba, then the effect should be there, and otherwise it's falsified. Yeah.
So I also find all the results coupling sound and gesture to be really impressive, and they make me think of a really basic idea, which is, and maybe somebody's tried this, so compare somebody talking where you allow them to gesture and then have another condition where you don't allow them to gesture, right? And then of course the idea would be now you have another, either people listening, you have a deep learning model, whatever, where you do some kind of analysis of perhaps the pitch, and would you detect differences in those two conditions?
Yeah, so I have two things to say about this. The research, there is research being done, has been done, which actually cite our paper as well, where you find higher ranges of F0 and people are encouraged to gesture. So the ranges are the prosodic modulation, so it seems. There is also research showing that there is no effect. And my idea was always, well, they're taking, for example, the mean of the fundamental frequency of the whole signal. Well, so I think these are dynamic effects. So you actually have to get at the kinematics before you can actually detect it in acoustics. So that's what I always thought to myself. I'm trying to go to sleep, right? But another thing is that maybe these are sensorimotor solutions. There are many ways to do it. So we know, for example, from this research on chest pulses, that not everybody is using a chest pulse to reach some kind of phonetic target or some kind of prosodic target. So if you're stressing some word, not everybody uses the chest. There are many sensorimotor solutions there are many degrees of freedom that you can lock to get the same thing, right? So I think that some people are not gesturing and still have a very nice prosodic modulation. So I'm not saying it's a necessary thing to reach some kind of vocal output. I'm saying that the constraints when gesturing are there, and they're necessarily there. But it's not that everybody is using it in the same way. Often with all these phonetics research, which you know very well, there are many sensorimotor solutions to reach the same goal. So we also, gesture researchers are not keen to admit that some people just don't gesture, right? So, and they're doing fine. So I think, I'm saying that the constraints when you're gesturing are always there, and they will have their effects, but they are not a necessary component of this vocal system.
So I'm kind of like a politics nerd, and some of the politicians that come up as disingenuous seem to have like some inverted relationship between their prosody and their emotions. What are like? How do you describe that sort of behavior? Are they trying to imitate, or like you're saying, like some people can actually like own this as behavior and use it to their advantage?
Yeah, so that actually ties in with your question, I guess, that you can, some people really rehearse their gesturing, right? And they become almost like uncanny in their movements. And I think politicians are using that as well in their ways. And then it's almost like pre-noetic consciousness, right? You have to keep some kind of, you have to keep it lower in your consciousness to let it operate naturally. If you're really going to think how to pick up a bottle, it will fail often, or more likely that it will fail. And I feel that gesture is the same thing. I never look at my gestures. I never consciously think about it, and it's only when I consciously think about it that the system kind of breaks down. So so I think it's precisely because you raise it into consciousness that it loses its natural dynamics. Yeah.
So there's clearly cases where gesture coupling happens at that conscious level.
Yeah.
We must win.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And like any consciously active skill, you can imagine being automatized.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out a framing in my mind what the alternative hypothesis is to this just emerging from vocalization, arm motion coupling that isn't necessarily just an automatization of emulating patterns of speech gesture coupling that are observed during the acquisition of language learning.
Yeah.
Or like, is there some alternative hypothesis there where there's a non-conscious communicative coupling that isn't just driven by the biomechanics?
Yeah, so I'm wholeheartedly saying, yes, there must be. The whole prosody system, for example, you can perceive a pitch accent where there is no peak in the fundamental frequency, no peak in the intensity, but just a longer duration or a longer pause, or just a longer duration of the phonation. And you will almost hear it as if there is a peak in the pitch, for example. So I'm saying, no, this physical impetus might just be its origin of the system. And there must be some kind of brain mechanism. I'm not saying that there was no brain mechanism. Of course, I'm emphasizing this emerges straightforwardly out of the system. I think even if there is some cognitive mechanism, it will use these biomechanical invariants to ease or simplify the computations, right? Whatever you want to call it. So it must be there. I'm just saying that the story runs much more smoothly everywhere for all these accounts. If you start with some kind of biomechanical invariant that is further repurposed and remodeled, as it were, for more sophisticated kind of movements that are maybe more consciously or at least more cognitively controlled. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I have a lot of rejections of these papers. They're very forceful. They say, well, this is when I was write up as really radical, and I think, yeah, but I do have to emphasize always there must be some cognitive component. So and then it's more easily accepted. So yeah,
Speaking of a cognitive component, do you think you gesture more when you're talking about gesture?
Yeah. I'm promoting the cause, right? No, I gesture more when I'm anxious or when I have to present or something, and I gesture. Or when I drink a beer, I gesture more. Yeah, so I'm not sure if it has to do with promoting the cause. But, yeah, maybe. Yeah. I've been training these little gestures for you.
I'm trying to think of how function of this, as we're trying to transfer information between people to sort of coordinate interactions to be successful. I'm thinking about that vocalizer and then that listener study that we were doing, and so it's I'm wondering to what extent do my behaviors and my vocalizations get mirrored into the people that are coordinating with it, and if that ends up actually being advantageous for us, trying to do things together. Tasks.
Yeah. Well, so I failed to mention one really strong finding in ecological psychology where people are just talking and they can hear each other in a conversation. And their postural sway will synchronize, and they've replicated this in another study. And this is spontaneous, right? So this is somehow, and when the situation is set up where they're more competitive in their speaking, then this kind of synchrony doesn't happen. So I'm always, with the pure synchrony kind of literature, I'm not sure whether synchrony is always advantageous, or I would be cautious to have such a simple kind of constraint on these systems. But I would think that just hearing somebody bodily tensioning is quite fruitful for understanding the pragmatic situation of how somebody reacts to what you're saying, for example. It helps when you hear somebody's emotions in somebody's voice. And I think gestures are part of that system.
I can't exactly remember which study it was, but there was one where you were looking at the synchrony of people across multiple speeds, and there was one in the fast condition where it seemed shifted. It was maybe you could go back.
Yeah. For the faster kind of, we see less. Especially for the arm motion, you have a more difficult, like a phasing relation.
Right, and one is like that's kind of an indication of the anticipatory of like this.
Yeah, so one thing you'll always see is that you get a negative mean asynchrony. So the listener will anticipate the vocalizer's moment of the beat. So you get these classic timing effects. You don't see it very well here, but it's like 34 degrees if you model it on a circular mean. So you have this negative mean asynchrony, so it seems like that they're doing some kind of timing that is much similar to a metronome in that sense. So I'm sure that they're not detecting the continuous movement in the acoustics, they're detecting some kind of peak that they naturally associate with the peak and deceleration of the movement, or some kind of stop, which I think is already like amazing, right? We can hear, how can we hear that? But it's not perfect, right? I had these Lisa Hsu figures, but you also see these 1 to 2 coupling. Some people were really doing one movement with 2 kinds of. So you have that. There is a lot of difference. There is still a lot of variability. But for now, I'm just saying, well, it's synchrony. Let's first acknowledge that, and then we can look better into the kind of differences that define the standard deviation of this distribution.
This isn't really a question, but I know that we kind of mentioned sign language earlier. But something that's interesting, like you did say how a lot of there's like facial use expressions, but I think something that's really interesting about that is that those like eyebrow raising and mouth movements are often like necessary for syntax and for grammar. So it's like a little different. Gesture, you don't necessarily have to have them when you're speaking. They're kind of like an addition. But if you do maybe want to look at sign language, I think it's really interesting to look at storytelling. Because it's a very different way of using sign language. I know in ASL, and you really see a lot more kind of like what I would say gestures that we see in spoken language, where there's a bit more like movement.
So modulation of the trajectory through some kind of intensity changes. Because in sign language you do have prosody, right? So you do have the concept of prosody, that you can express a sign in many different ways, right? You are right. So I'm being too simplistic about. I don't know how the pragmatics work in terms of the facial movements, for example. And maybe it just doesn't generalize to that system at all. A lot of gesture research also studies sign language, but because I always assume that gesturing is referential in that sense. And I don't know, sign language is interesting to me, but it's not necessarily, I don't think they're the same.
So in your very last slide, you had this claim about, so ontogeny, phylogenetic solutions, and so I think it was the slide before this one, or the one right after.
That's the floor.
That one. So you were talking about in the cognitive case that gesture-speech coupling requires a purely neural interface.
Well, this is not my
Right. I was just wondering what you meant by that, and if you could sort of unpack that so I can understand that theoretical position clearly as distinct from yours.
So the classic accounts suggest that gesture and speech trajectories are preconceived at different neural systems. They are, if you will, formulated by different kind of dynamic brain interfaces, and they need to couple somehow. And the general idea is that there is some kind of coupling mechanism within the brain that allows to match up acoustic kind of prosody modulations with the trajectory of a movement. They were pre-planned or pre-computed in the conceptualization phase, in this cognitive kind of thinking. These are on the moment they are not coupled yet. So the idea is that in the conceptualization phase, these systems emerge together, but not coupled already in the conceptualization. So you need something that matches these two systems together. And the idea is that it's a purely neural interface in the sense that the coupling or the synchronized timing of some kind of pitch accent, for example, in a movement, needs to be computed before it can actually occur. But the computation at least or is simplified or is not necessary if I only need to perform the movement to have effects on my acoustics. So you simplify the computation if you still want to call it computation, because you're allowing the system to couple naturally. And you could even, if you still want to have some cognitive mechanism, that cognitive mechanism may also go up that kind of sensing of a physical impetus and modulate it more dramatically. So I think that a purely neural interface needs to account for this biomechanical invariant, and at least and minimally it simplifies whatever the system has to do. Instead of computing a whole trajectory and finding some kind of moment where they are aligned in their intensities, they're naturally aligned out of this system. They're part of one physical system, so they will naturally align, and the cognitive system only needs to amplify it. But still, you run into problems about timing, so you still need a trajectory that somehow you still need something, right? So I'm not saying that it magically appears. So.
If there are no further questions, we take this opportunity to thank our speakers.